The gavel had not yet fallen when the courthouse doors exploded inward, and Morag Gorehorn strode through the splinters like she owned the mountain itself. "Stop," she said, and the single word rang louder than the magistrate's bell. Every head in the packed hall turned. Boots scraped on the pine floorboards. Someone dropped a tin cup, and it clattered down the aisle like a dying man's plea. At the front of the room, chained at wrist and ankle, Tobias Easton knelt on the cold boards before Magistrate Silas Kest's high bench. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his jaw dark with 3 days of stubble, and his eyes, when they lifted to see who had just torn the doors from their hinges, went wide with something between disbelief and hope he did not dare to feel. "The debtor Tobias Easton," Magistrate Kest intoned, ignoring the interruption with the practiced calm of a man who had learned long ago that fear could be worn like a coat. "Having failed to produce the sum of 240 silver crowns owed to the Ironwood Trading Company for cargo lost under his watch, is hereby remanded to labor in the deep pits of Blackridge Hollow until such debt is satisfied in full or in blood." "He will not go to your pits," Morag said, and now she was walking, and the crowd parted before her the way grass parts before a wolf, because no one in that room was fool enough to stand in the path of an orc woman built like a war horse and moving like a spear. She wore fitted leathers, dark and oiled, laced tight up the sides in the old clan style, the leather vest cinched close over a body corded with muscle, and softened only by the swell of her hips and breasts beneath the buckles. A hunting knife rode her thigh. Her black hair was bound in a single thick braid threaded through with small iron rings, mourning rings, the kind an orc widow wore for a husband not yet a year in the ground. Her tusks, pale and gleaming, framed a mouth set now in a hard, furious line, though her yellow eyes, when they found Tobias kneeling in his chains, softened for just a heartbeat before the fire came back into them. "And who," Magistrate Kest said, setting down his gavel with exaggerated patience, "are you to interrupt a lawful proceeding of this court? I am Morag Gorehorn, widow of Morag Gorehorn, claim holder of the eastern seam." She stopped at the low rail that separated the court's business from its audience, close enough now that Tobias could see the iron rings in her braid trembling with the force of her breathing. "And I am this man's guarantor." The word landed in the room like a dropped anvil. Somewhere behind her, a logger muttered something to his neighbor. Magistrate Kest's mouth thinned. "Guarantor," he repeated, as though tasting something sour. "You understand what that word means, orc woman. You understand that to stand guarantor for a debtor is to take his debt as your own, every crown of it, every day of labor, every consequence should he fail to satisfy the court. Should you fail. "I understand it better than you do, little man in your little chair," Morag said. "My people have paid debts in blood since before your grandfather's grandfather learned to write his name. I know exactly what I am claiming." She turned then and looked down at Tobias, not with pity, which he could not have borne, but with something fiercer, something that looked almost like recognition, like she had been waiting 3 months for the chance to say this in front of every soul who mattered in Blackridge Hollow. "This man saved my life on the Cutter's Pass road when he owed me nothing, and had every reason to let the arrows find me instead of him. I do not forget such debts. I do not let them go unpaid." Tobias's throat worked. His voice, when it came, was hoarse from 3 days in a holding cell with nothing but stale bread and worse water. "Morag, you don't have to do this. 240 crowns. It's not your debt." "It is now," she said, without looking away from the magistrate, "unless this court has some law against an orc widow paying what she owes." The hall had gone dead silent. Magistrate Kest's eyes flicked to the man seated in the front row of benches, a lean, silver-haired merchant in a fine gray coat, the local factor of the Ironwood Trading Company, Corwin Ash, who had brought the suit against Tobias in the first place. Ash's face had gone carefully blank, but his fingers, laced together in his lap, had gone white at the knuckle. "There is no such law," Kest admitted at last, the words dragged out of him like a splinter from a wound. "A guarantor may stand for a debtor under the old frontier codes, provided she pledges collateral equal to the debt, and provided the creditor accepts the substitution. "I have collateral," Morag said. "My husband's claim on the eastern seam is worth 10 times what this man owes. I pledge it, in full this hour, before this court and every witness in it." A murmur went through the crowd, not of sympathy, not yet, but of raw astonishment. An orc claim on the eastern seam was no small thing. Even men who hated orcs on principle knew good ore when they heard its worth spoken aloud. Corwin Ash rose slowly from his bench. "The company will need time to assess the claim's value before." "You will accept it now," Morag said, rounding on him with a speed that made the merchant flinch back half a step, "or I will stand in this hall and tell every miner and logger present exactly how convenient it was that my husband died alone in a shaft your company inspected not 3 days before the roof came down on him. I imagine they would find that story very interesting, Master Ash. I imagine they would want to know more." The color drained from Corwin Ash's face so fast that Tobias, still chained on the floorboards, felt a chill go through him that had nothing to do with the mountain cold seeping through the courthouse walls. He did not understand yet what she meant. But he understood the shape of a threat when he heard one, and he understood, watching Ash's composure crack for just an instant before the merchant smoothed it back into place, that there was far more beneath the surface of Blackridge Hollow than a simple debt over lost cargo. Magistrate Kest cleared his throat, clearly eager to move the proceedings away from that particular ledge. "The court will accept the substitution of collateral, pending a formal valuation within 30 days. Should the claim prove insufficient, or should the guarantor default in any particular, the original sentence stands against her now as much as against him." His eyes, cold and pale, found Morag's. "You understand that, orc woman. If this goes wrong, it is not only his life you have wagered, it is yours." "I understand," Morag said, "better than any of you." She crossed to Tobias then in front of the whole room and knelt an orc widow, kneeling on a courthouse floor before a chained human debtor, and if anyone in that room thought it strange, not one of them dared say so aloud with her that close. She took his manacled wrists in her hands, and her fingers, calloused and strong, were gentler than he had ever imagined they could be. "You are mine to answer for now, Tobias Easton," she said, low, so only he could hear it beneath the rising murmur of the crowd. "Whether you like it or not." "I like it," he said, before he could stop himself, and something in her yellow eyes flickered surprise, and beneath it, banked and dangerous, a heat that promised this was only the beginning. The bailiff struck the chains from his wrists a few minutes later, and Tobias Easton walked out of the Blackridge Hollow courthouse a free man in the eyes of the law, and a debtor still in every way that mattered, bound now not to a company ledger, but to an orc woman he had met only once before, on a mountain road 3 months past, in the worst 5 minutes of his life. He remembered it as if it had happened yesterday. The caravan had been 6 wagons strong, hauling Ironwood Trading Company payroll and tools up the Cutters Pass road toward Blackridge Hollow, and Tobias had been one of 4 hired guards riding the flanks, paid decent coin to keep bandits off honest cargo. Morag had been a passenger that trip, newly widowed, traveling alone from the lowlands to claim her husband's remains and settle his affairs at the camp where he had died, and the caravan master had taken her coin without much grace, seating her in the last wagon with the tool crates, because none of the drivers wanted an orc woman near the payroll chest. The bandits had hit them at the narrowest bend of the pass, where the road pinched between a granite wall and a 200-foot drop, 6 men with crossbows and worse manners, and in the chaos of screaming horses and snapping bowstrings, Tobias had seen one of them drag Morag's wagon door open and level a crossbow at her chest before she'd so much as drawn the knife at her hip. He had not thought. He had simply put his horse between the bolt and the wagon, and taken the shot meant for her high in the shoulder, and it had knocked him from the saddle and very nearly under the wheels of the very wagon he'd been trying to save. She had killed the bandit with her bare hands before he hit the ground. He remembered that much clearly, the terrible efficient violence of it, and then her face above his, orc fierce and human soft all at once, pressing a wad of cloth to his shoulder and swearing at him in her own tongue, and then, when she remembered he could not understand a word of it, swearing at him in his. "You absolute fool," she had said, tearing his shirt open to see the wound. "You do not know me. Why would you take a bolt for a stranger?" Seemed like the thing to do, he'd managed, through the pain, and she had laughed, a startled, unwilling bark of a laugh, like it had been dragged out of her against her will, and something in her yellow eyes had changed in that moment, watching him grin up at her through the blood loss like an idiot. They had reached Blackridge Hollow 2 days later. She had thanked him with a formal orc courtesy, a hand pressed flat over his heart, a phrase in her own language he did not understand but that had made the old orc laborers watching bow their heads, and then she had gone to bury her husband's ashes and settle his debts, and Tobias had gone back down the mountain with the caravan, his shoulder stitched and aching, thinking he would probably never see her again. He had thought about her more than he liked to admit in the months since. He had not expected to see her storm a courthouse to save his life. The debt that had brought him back up that same mountain road, in chains this time instead of on horseback, had been a cruelty of simple bad luck. The very same bandit gang, or what remained of it, reinforced with fresh recruits, had struck the caravan again on his next run, 3 weeks after Cutter's Pass, and this time they had gotten away with a strongbox of company payroll despite everything the guards could do. Corwin Ash, eager to recoup the loss and disinclined to blame his own company's miserly guard budget, had found it far easier to point the finger at the one guard who'd already proven himself reckless enough to throw his body in front of a crossbow bolt for a stranger. The suit had named Tobias personally negligent. The debtors' court at Blackridge Hollow, the nearest circuit court to the site of the theft, had summoned him, tried him, and very nearly buried him in the pits for a crime that had mostly been the simple bad fortune of an ambush he'd fought against with everything he had. He walked out of the courthouse now into the thin mountain sunlight, free of his chains and utterly unfree in every other sense, and found Morag waiting for him on the steps with her arms crossed, and an expression that dared him to say one more foolish thing about not deserving her help. "You didn't have to pledge the claim," he said anyway, "because some things needed saying even when they were foolish. That's everything your husband left you." "My husband left me a mountain full of debts and a hole in the ground where a man used to be," Morag said. "The claim is worth something only if someone digs it. I would rather spend it keeping you breathing than watch it sit in a company ledger gathering dust while you rot in a pit shaft." She studied him, head tilted, the iron rings in her braid catching the light. "Besides, you are mine to answer for now. I intend to collect on the debt myself. Is that so?" Something in her tone had shifted, gone lower, warmer, and Tobias felt his pulse answer it before his mind caught up. "And how do you intend to collect exactly?" Morag's mouth curved, slow and dangerous, tusks gleaming. "We will discuss terms," she said. "Once you have eaten something and slept somewhere that is not a holding cell. You look like a corpse someone forgot to bury, Tobias Easton, and I did not fight a magistrate for a corpse." The camp of Blackridge Hollow sprawled up the mountainside above the courthouse in a scatter of timber buildings, log-walled bunkhouses, a sawmill whose great wheel groaned day and night, and beyond it all, cut into the granite flank of the peak itself, the black mouths of the mine shafts that gave the place its name and its wealth, and all too often, its dead. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys into a sky the color of hammered tin. The air smelled of pine sap and coal smoke, and underneath it, faint and metallic, the smell of the ore that drew men and orcs both up into these unforgiving heights in search of fortune. Morag led him not to the company bunkhouses, but up a narrow track behind the sawmill to a small cabin set apart from the rest, half timber and half dug into the hillside, with a low stone chimney and a single shuttered window. It had been her husband's, she explained, part of the claim she still held even as its ore sat unworked, a claim holder's right to a dwelling on company land, one of the few privileges ironwood trading had not yet found a way to strip from her. "You'll stay here," she said, pushing the door open with her shoulder. "Under my roof, under my eye. That is the law now. A guarantor keeps her debtor closed so she can answer for his conduct." A flicker of dry humor crossed her face. "It also means, Tobias Easton, that I intend to know exactly what you are doing at every hour of the day, and I do not intend to be gentle about enforcing it." "Sounds like I traded one set of chains for another," he said, but he was smiling when he said it, and she caught the smile and answered it with one of her own, sharp and pleased. "Better chains," she said. "Softer ones." The cabin's single room held a narrow bed, a stone hearth, a rough table, and little else besides an old oak war axe mounted above the mantel that Tobias guessed had belonged to her husband. He tried not to look at it too long. Morag noticed anyway. "Borak," she said before he could ask. "He was a good man, a steady man. We were matched by our clan elders when I was 20, and I did not love him at first, but I came to. He died in the eastern seam 6 months ago when a support timber gave way and brought half the shaft down on him and 2 others." Her jaw tightened. "The company inspector cleared the timber as sound not 3 days before it fell. I have never believed that was chance." "You think someone weakened it on purpose?" "I think Corwin Ash wanted that seam mined out under a company crew instead of paying a claim holder's share to an orc widow. And I think dead men do not argue about shares." She said it flatly, without drama, the way a person speaks of a wound so old it has stopped bleeding and simply aches instead. "I have no proof. I have had 6 months to look for it and found nothing but silence and men who will not meet my eyes. But I have not stopped looking, and I do not intend to." Tobias sat slowly on the edge of the narrow bed, his shoulder, the old crossbow wound aching faintly the way it always did when the weather turned. "That's why you threatened Ash in the courtroom." "About the inspection, that is why." She crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe, studying him with an intensity that made his skin feel too warm despite the cold mountain air seeping through the log walls. "You are tangled in something larger than a debt over stolen payroll, Tobias Easton. I do not think it is chance that the same company that killed my husband is also the company that wants you buried in its pits. I think Ash is a man who solves inconvenient problems by making them disappear underground, one way or another." "That's a comforting thought to fall asleep to. I did not say it to comfort you." She pushed off the doorframe and crossed to him, and up close in the small cabin she seemed even larger than she had in the courthouse, not threatening, but present in a way that filled the whole room, that made the air feel charged, like the moment before a mountain storm broke. "I said it because you should know exactly what you have walked into, standing beside me. It will not be simple. It will not be safe. If you want to run from it, I will not stop you. I will give you coin for the road and no hard feelings." "I'm not running," Tobias said, and meant it more fully than he had meant almost anything in his life. "I took a crossbow bolt for you on a mountain road because it seemed like the thing to do. I'm not going to run from you now because things got complicated." Something moved behind her yellow eyes, want and wariness, and a kind of hunger she seemed to be fighting to keep leashed. "Careful, Tobias Easton," she said softly. "I am not a woman who forgets a debt, and I am not a woman who forgets a kindness either. If you keep saying things like that to me, I am going to start believing you mean them." "I do mean them." "Then we will have a problem," Morag said, "because I have not wanted a man look at me the way you look at me since before Borak died, and I do not know what to do with wanting something again." She said it like a confession dragged out of her, blunt and unguarded in a way he suspected she rarely allowed herself to be. And then, as if embarrassed by her own honesty, she turned briskly toward the hearth and began laying a fire, leaving Tobias sitting on the narrow bed with his heart hammering, and the distinct sense that he had just been handed something far more dangerous and far more precious than a courtroom victory. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of them had expected, but both, Tobias came to realize, secretly welcomed. By the terms of the guarantor's bond, he was to work off what portion of the debt the company's assessors did not accept as covered by Morag's pledged claim, laboring in the sawmill rather than the mine shafts. Morag had insisted on that condition before the ink dried on the court's ruling, refusing flatly to let him anywhere near the pits that had killed her husband. Ash's clerks had grumbled but conceded. An Orc widow's claim on the eastern seam, once surveyed, proved rich enough that the company had little grounds to argue. So Tobias spent his days hauling timber and feeding the great groaning sawwheel, and his evenings walking back down the mountain track to the small cabin that was, against every expectation he'd carried into Blackridge Hollow in chains, beginning to feel like something close to a home. It was on the fourth evening that the dares began, though neither of them called them that at first. "You flinched," Morag said, watching him wince as he set down an armful of firewood, his shoulder aching from a long day at the saw. "The old wound, it aches when the weather turns, nothing more. Let me see it." When he hesitated, she rolled her eyes, an oddly human gesture on so orcish a face, and reached over to tug his collar aside herself before he could object, examining the old puckered scar with a critical eye. "You let this heal badly. Some fool of a lowland healer, I would guess." "Some fool of a lowland healer had 4 other men to see to that same night, and I told him to see to them first." "Of course you did." She said it half fond, half exasperated, her thumb tracing the edge of the scar in a way that sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "You are a very foolish man, Tobias Easton. So everyone keeps telling me." "I dare you," Morag said suddenly, sitting back on her heels, something sparking mischievous and reckless in her yellow eyes, "to spar with me, right now, in the yard, unarmed. You'd flatten me in half a minute." "Probably," she agreed, entirely unbothered. "But I want to see if you're as brave standing up as you were bleeding on a mountain road, unless you're afraid." It was, he understood even as he rose to take the bait, precisely the kind of dare designed to work on a man's pride, and it worked on his exactly as well as she'd intended. They sparred in the cleared yard behind the cabin under a sky gone violet with dusk, and she did flatten him, twice, laughing outright the second time when he landed flat on his back in the dirt and simply lay there grinning up at the emerging stars rather than admit defeat gracefully. "You could yield," she said, standing over him, offering a hand. "Where's the fun in that?" He took her hand, let her haul him up with a strength that made him feel, not for the first time, pleasantly aware of exactly how much stronger than him she was. Their faces were very close when he came up, closer than sparring strictly required, and for a long moment neither of them moved to step back. "My turn," he said low. "I dare you to tell me one true thing about yourself that nobody else in this camp knows." Something flickered across her face, surprise that he'd turned the game back on her, and then, grudgingly, respect. "I am afraid," she said, "that if I let myself want you the way I am starting to want you, and something happens to you the way something happened to Borak, I will not survive it a second time." She said it fast, like tearing off a bandage, and then looked almost furious at herself for having said it at all. Tobias did not know what to say to that. No clever answer rose to meet the raw honesty of it, so he simply reached up, slow, giving her every chance to pull away, and brushed a strand of dark hair back from her face where it had escaped her braid during the sparring. "I dare you," he said, "to let me try to be worth that risk." Morag did not answer with words. She answered by closing the distance between them and kissing him hard, hungry, her hand fisting in the front of his shirt like she meant to make certain he could not escape even if he wanted to. And he did not want to, not for one single heartbeat, kissing her back with everything the last 4 days of careful, aching restraint had built up in him. She tasted of the mountain air and the spiced tea she drank in the mornings, and when she finally broke away, both of them breathing hard, she looked almost startled at herself. "Well," she said, "that was not part of the dare. I'm not complaining." "Neither," Morag admitted, "am I." But when she stepped back, some of the fierce openness banked itself behind her eyes again, and he understood, without her needing to explain it, that she was not a woman who gave her heart lightly twice in one lifetime, and that whatever door had just cracked open between them, she intended to walk through it slowly, on her own terms, even if the wanting in her eyes said she'd have preferred to run. He did not push. He had learned enough about her already to know that pushing would only make her retreat, and he found, to his own quiet surprise, that he did not mind the slower road. There was something in simply being wanted, being chosen, deliberately, by a woman who could have chosen anyone and had chosen him, that felt more precious than any speed of arrival. The company did not let them enjoy the fragile peace for long. 10 days after the courthouse, Magistrate Kest summoned them both back down the mountain track, and this time it was not a debt hearing that awaited them but a formal challenge, delivered by Corwin Ash's own hand in front of a gathering crowd of loggers and miners drawn by the promise of spectacle. "The company disputes the sufficiency of the pledged collateral," Ash announced, his silver hair immaculate despite the mountain wind, his voice pitched to carry across the muddy square outside the courthouse where half the camp had gathered to watch. "The Eastern Seam claim, upon full survey, proves entangled with unresolved questions of rightful inheritance. Until those questions are settled, the company cannot in good conscience accept it as valid guarantee against the debtor's obligation." "Unresolved questions," Morag repeated, her voice flat and dangerous. "My husband is dead, Ash. I am his widow. There is no question to resolve." "There is if it can be shown," Ash said, and here his eyes slid, deliberate and cold, toward the magistrate's bench where Kest sat waiting like a man who had rehearsed this moment, that the claim holder had reason to wish her husband dead before his time. Inheritance obtained by foul means is no inheritance at all under frontier law. Surely you understand, Orc woman, why the company cannot simply take your word. The crowd's murmur turned ugly and fast, the way crowds always did when given a scandal to chew on, and Tobias felt Morag go rigid beside him, her hand dropping instinctively toward the knife at her hip before iron discipline stilled it. "You accuse me of murdering my own husband," she said, each word bitten off like a blade being drawn. "The company makes no accusation," Ash said smoothly. "The company merely requests that the matter be settled before this court, as frontier law provides, by trial." He let the word hang, savoring it. "By combat, if the widow disputes the charge and wishes to prove her claim in blood, as her own people's custom allows, or by hanging, should she refuse the trial and the charge stand unanswered." It was, Tobias understood in a sick lurch of comprehension, a trap built with exquisite care. Ash could not simply arrest Morag outright, not without proof, not without risking every Orc laborer in the camp rising up in fury. But he could force her into a corner where either she fought for her life in front of a hostile crowd, or she hanged for a crime Tobias was now certain, with cold and total conviction, that Corwin Ash himself had engineered. "I did not kill my husband," Morag said, loud enough for the whole square to hear, her chin lifted, refusing to flinch even as the crowd's muttering swelled around her like a rising tide. "But I will not run from your trial either. Name your champion, Ash. I will meet him." "Morag," Tobias started, low, urgent. "Do not," she said without looking at him, "tell me to run. I have run from nothing in my life, and I will not begin now, least of all from a lie." Ash's smile was thin and satisfied. "The company names Bram Thorek as its champion," he said, and a ripple went through the crowd at the name, murmurs of recognition, of dread. Tobias did not know the man, but the reaction around him told him everything. Bram Thorek was no ordinary duelist. "The trial will be held in 3 days' time in the mill yard, before the full camp as witness. Should the widow fall, her claim falls with her, and the debtor's original sentence stands in full. Should she prevail, the charge is answered and the claim stands valid beyond further challenge." 3 days, Magistrate Kest confirmed, banging his gavel once as though that settled the matter, though nothing about it felt settled to Tobias at all. It felt instead like the ground shifting beneath his feet, like the mountain itself deciding to swallow them whole. They did not speak much on the walk back up to the cabin. Morag's jaw stayed tight the whole way, her strides eating up the track faster than usual, and Tobias half ran to keep pace, understanding without being told that she needed the motion, the burn of exertion, to keep from shattering entirely. It was only once they were inside, door shut against the mountain wind, that she finally let some of the iron control drop from her shoulders, and he saw, for one unguarded moment, not the fierce widow who had stormed a courthouse, but a woman who had just been told, in front of half the camp, that she might be hanged for a lie within the week. Bram Thorek killed 4 men in duels for this company, she said, staring into the cold hearth rather than at him. 2 of them were orcs bigger than me. He is not a man. He is a weapon the company keeps leashed for exactly this purpose. Then we find another way, Tobias said. We find proof. Real proof about the timber, about the inspection. If Ash is behind Borak's death, there has to be something. A record, a witness, someone paid to look away who might now be willing to talk. In 3 days, her laugh had no humor in it. I have looked for 6 months, Tobias. 6 months and found nothing but locked doors. Then we look harder, he said, crossing to her, taking her by the shoulders and turning her gently to face him. I am not going to let them hang you for a lie, and I am not going to let you walk into a duel with a killer without trying every single thing I can think of first. That's not who I am, and it's not who you're going to let me be either. For a long moment, Morag simply looked at him, searching his face for something. He wasn't certain what, until whatever she was searching for she apparently found, because the tightness around her eyes eased fractionally and she leaned forward, resting her forehead against his in a gesture so unexpectedly gentle from a woman built for violence that his chest ached with it. I dare you, she said quietly, to actually find something. Because I am afraid, Tobias, and I have not been afraid like this in a very long time, and I do not know what to do with it except be angry instead. Then be angry, he said. I'll do the finding. The next 2 days became a blur of quiet, desperate investigation. Tobias called in every scrap of goodwill he'd built at the sawmill. A grizzled old logger named Pell, who'd taken a liking to him, owed him a favor from a card game weeks back. And it was Pell who pointed him toward Grendel Voss, the mine's timber inspector, a nervous, weather-beaten man who drank alone at the edge of the camp's one tavern and flinched whenever Ash's name came up in conversation. It took an evening of patient talk, 2 bottles of cheap spirits, and a promise from Tobias that no harm would come to him for speaking, before Grendel Voss finally cracked. I inspected that shaft 3 days before it came down, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper even in the empty corner of the tavern where they sat. The support timber was sound. I swore to it in the company log because it was sound. May every god in the sky strike me if I lie, but someone went back in after my inspection. I found saw marks on the replacement beam when I went down after the collapse to help with the body's fresh cuts, cross-grain, exactly the kind of cut that would make a beam fail under load days later instead of at once. Someone weakened that support after I'd already cleared it. Who? Tobias asked, though he suspected he already knew. I don't know who swung the saw, Grendel said, but I know who ordered the inspection log sealed before the widow's own claim assessors could see it, Ash himself. Sealed it the same day the bodies came up, quick as anything before proper questions could be asked. Would you swear to that, in front of the court, in front of the whole camp? Grendel Voss's hands shook around his cup. Ash would ruin me, worse than ruin me. He's trying to hang an innocent woman, Tobias said, leaning in, low and urgent. He's already tried to bury me alive in his pits over a debt that wasn't my fault. How many more of us does he get to ruin before somebody stops him? It took another hour of arguing, of Tobias laying bare exactly what was at stake, not just Morag's life, but the truth of a man's death that deserved better than a company's convenient silence before Grendel finally, miserably, agreed to testify, provided Tobias, and Morag could guarantee some manner of protection for him afterward. It was not the ironclad proof Tobias had hoped for. It was not a confession from Ash's own lips. But it was a thread, and threads, pulled hard enough at the right moment, could unravel a great deal. He returned to the cabin well past midnight to find Morag awake, sharpening her knife by the light of the banked fire with the restless, repetitive motion of someone who needed her hands busy to keep her mind from a darker road. "I found something," he said, and told her everything. The sawmarks on the replacement beam, the sealed log, Grendel Voss's shaking hands, and his reluctant promise to speak. When he finished, Morag set down her knife very carefully, as though afraid of what her hands might do otherwise, and was silent for a long moment. "It is not enough to clear my name outright," she said finally. "Ash will call him a liar, a drunk, a man with a grudge. The trial will still happen in a day's time regardless, but it is enough," and here something fierce and grateful broke through the exhaustion in her voice, "to make certain that if I fall in that yard tomorrow, the truth does not fall with me. That is worth more than I can say, Tobias Easton." "You're not going to fall," he said. "I won't let that happen. You cannot fight Bram Thorek for me. It is my trial, my name, my claim." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking to fight him. I'm telling you I'm not leaving your side until this is over, one way or the other. And if there is anything at all I can do in that yard to help you win, I will do it without a second thought for what it costs me." Morag reached out and pulled him down onto the narrow bed beside her, not with the hunger of their earlier kiss, but with something quieter, more desperate, the need of two people who did not know what the next day would bring and wanted, before it came, to hold on to something solid and warm and real. They did not speak again for a long while. He held her through the night, her head against his chest, her breathing slowly evening out into something almost like sleep, and Tobias lay awake in the dark with his heart full to breaking, thinking that whatever the mill yard held for them tomorrow, he had never in his life felt so certain of anything as he felt certain of her. The mill yard, when the appointed hour came, was packed with more people than Tobias had ever seen gathered in Blackridge Hollow at once: loggers, miners, orc laborers standing apart in their own wary cluster, company clerks. And at the front, on a raised platform of rough planks, Magistrate Kest and Corwin Ash sat like men attending a hanging they already considered a formality. Bram Thorek was everything the Whispers had promised, and worse, a mountain of a man, scarred across one cheek, carrying a two-handed sword with the easy familiarity of someone who had used it to end more lives than he could likely remember. He looked at Morag the way a butcher looks at livestock, and Tobias had to force himself to breathe evenly, to keep the fury rising in his chest from showing on his face, because showing it now would help no one. Morag stood at the center of the cleared yard in her fitted leathers, knife in hand, her braid bound tight, her chin lifted, and if she felt even a fraction of the fear she'd confessed to him 2 nights before, she did not let one flicker of it show to the watching crowd. "Before the trial begins," Magistrate Kest called out, "does the accused wish to speak?" "I do," Morag said, and turned not to the magistrate but to the crowd itself, raising her voice to carry across the whole yard. "I did not kill my husband. I have proof that his death was no accident of failed timber but sabotage, ordered to seize a claim the company did not want to pay an orc widow her rightful share of." She gestured, and from the edge of the crowd, pale and shaking but present, Grendel Voss stepped forward. What followed was chaos: Ash on his feet shouting objections, Kest banging his gavel for order, the crowd surging and murmuring as Grendel Voss, in a halting, terrified voice, told them all what he had found on that replacement beam, and who had sealed the inspection log before honest eyes could see it. It was not enough, exactly as Morag had predicted. To end the trial outright, Ash recovered his composure fast enough to call the timber inspector a drunk and a liar with a grudge over lost wages, and enough of the crowd, conditioned by years of company propaganda and old prejudice against orcs, seemed willing to believe him. But it was enough to plant a seed. Tobias watched it take root in the faces around him, doubt where before there had been only easy certainty, Enough, he prayed silently, to matter later, whatever happened in the yard in the next several minutes. The trial stands, Kest declared when he had finally hammered the crowd back into something like order. Combat to yield or to death. Widow Gorehorn against the company's champion. Begin. Bram Thorek did not wait for a second invitation. He came at Morag like an avalanche, sword swinging in a great arcing blow that would have cleaved a lesser fighter in half, and Tobias's heart stopped in his chest as she rolled beneath it, coming up fast with her knife flashing, only to be sent sprawling by a backhand blow from the duelist's offhand that she had not quite managed to avoid. The fight that followed was brutal and fast, and utterly unlike the playful sparring in the yard behind the cabin. Thorek was strong beyond anything Tobias had witnessed, and he fought with the cold, patient cruelty of a man who enjoyed drawing out an execution, letting Morag land small cuts and bruises against him that barely seemed to register while he methodically wore her down with blows that she could only barely deflect or avoid. Blood ran from a gash above her eye. Her breathing had gone ragged, and still she did not yield, circling, striking, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her break. It was on Thorek's next great overhand blow, one that Morag, exhausted, bleeding, a half-second slower than she had been at the fight's start, did not quite manage to fully avoid, that Tobias understood with sudden, sickening clarity that she was going to lose. He did not think. He had never been a man who thought first and acted second when someone he loved stood in danger. He had proven that on a mountain road 3 months ago, taking a crossbow bolt meant for a stranger, and he proved it again now, throwing himself forward past the low rope that marked the trial's boundary, straight into the path of Thorek's blade as it descended toward Morag's exposed side. No. Morag's scream tore through the yard as Tobias caught the blow not on his own flesh. Some instinct honed by years of caravan guard training had him diving to shove her sideways at the last possible instant, sending them both sprawling clear of the strike, rather than simply sacrificing himself uselessly. But the movement cost him. Thorek's boot caught him hard in the ribs as he scrambled up, sending him crashing back down, and the duelist rounded on him with a fury at the interruption, sword lifting for a strike that would have ended things instantly. "The trial is between the widow and myself," Thorek snarled. "Interfering debtor, I will finish you first, then her." "Then finish me," Tobias said, forcing himself up onto one knee despite the fire in his ribs, staring up at the massive duelist without flinching, "because I am not moving from this spot while you're trying to kill her." It was, he would reflect much later, possibly the single most reckless thing he had ever done, and it worked precisely because it bought Morag the 2 seconds she needed. While Thorek's attention snapped fully onto Tobias, dismissing the interfering debtor as an irritation to be swatted aside before returning to his real business, Morag came up off the ground behind him with a speed that belied her exhaustion, and drove her knife hilt-deep into the gap beneath his sword arm where his armor did not quite meet. Bram Thorek's roar of pain echoed off the surrounding mountains. He staggered, sword arm going numb, and Morag was already moving again, sweeping his legs out from under him with a brutal, practiced strike that sent the massive duelist crashing down into the mud of the mill yard hard enough to knock the breath from him entirely. She stood over him, knife raised, chest heaving, blood streaking her face, and for one taut, terrible moment the whole yard held its breath, waiting to see whether she would end it. "Yield," she said instead, voice ragged but clear enough to carry. "Yield and live." Thorek, staring up at the blade above his throat at the fury and the restraint both blazing in her yellow eyes, chose the sensible answer for once in his violent life. "I yield," he grated out. The crowd erupted. Not entirely in her favor. Not yet. Old prejudice did not dissolve in a single moment, no matter how dramatic. But enough voices rose in shocked, grudging approval that Tobias, still on one knee in the mud with his ribs screaming, felt something in his chest loosen that had been clenched tight since the moment Ash had announced his challenge 2 days before. Morag turned from the fallen duelist and crossed to him in 3 long strides, dropping to her knees beside him, her hands running over him with frantic urgency, checking for wounds. "You absolute, complete fool," she said, and her voice cracked on the words. "You threw yourself in front of a blade for me. Again." "Seemed like the thing to do," Tobias managed, echoing his own words from Cutter's past 3 months before, and Morag let out a sound that was half a sob and half a furious, disbelieving laugh, and kissed him hard enough to bruise, right there in the mud in front of the entire camp, with no care left for who might be watching. But the day was not yet done with them. Magistrate Kest, his authority visibly rattled by the trial's outcome, and the doubt Grendel Voss's testimony had sown through the crowd, seemed determined to salvage something from the wreckage of Ash's scheme. As Morag helped Tobias to his feet, Kest rose from the platform, and beside him Corwin Ash's composure had finally, entirely cracked. "This proves nothing," Ash snarled, loud enough for the crowd to hear, his careful merchant's mask slipping to reveal something far uglier beneath. "A duel won by an interfering debtor's trick proves nothing about the murder charge. The widow still stands accused. I demand the sentence be carried out regardless. Hang her for the crime the trial by combat was meant to answer, and be done with this farce." It was a desperate gambit, and a transparent one, but Magistrate Kest, whose own position and profit were tangled tightly enough with Ash's schemes that he had little choice but to follow where the merchant led, seized on it with visible relief at having an escape from the trial's inconvenient result. "The charge of murder was never formally withdrawn," Kest said, his voice gaining false confidence as he spoke. "Trial by combat answered the challenge to the guarantor's claim. It does not, strictly, answer the underlying accusation. Seize the widow. She will hang within the hour as the original charge demands." What happened next happened with a speed that left Tobias's blood running cold, even as he moved to stop it. Company guardsmen who had clearly been positioned in advance, Tobias realized with sick fury. In case the duel did not go the way Ash had planned, surged forward from the edges of the crowd and seized Morag before she could fully recover from the duel's exhaustion, dragging her, despite her furious struggling, toward the old gallows platform that stood at the edge of the mill yard, a grim relic kept ostensibly for the punishment of thieves and worse, but which Tobias understood in that instant Ash intended to use for a far darker purpose. "This is illegal," Tobias shouted, forcing his battered body forward, shoving through the crowd that had moments before been cheering Morag's victory and now stood frozen, uncertain, unwilling to intervene against armed company guards on their own account. "The trial answered the charge. You cannot simply—" "I can do whatever this court permits," Ash snarled, "and this court permits whatever I say it does." They had Morag on the platform now, a noose already looped and waiting prepared in advance. Tobias understood with fresh horror, exactly as Ash had prepared everything else, certain enough of his own control over the proceedings that he had never truly intended to let the duel's outcome matter at all. Morag fought the guards with everything her exhausted body had left, but there were 4 of them holding her, and the rope was already sliding toward her throat, and the crowd's uncertain murmur was doing nothing whatsoever to stop what was about to happen. Tobias did not remember crossing the remaining distance to the platform. He remembered only that he was suddenly there at the foot of the gallows steps, and that Grendel Voss, brave, terrified Grendel Voss, who had already risked everything once that day, was shouting something from the crowd's edge that cut through the chaos like a blade. "The seal!" Grendel screamed. I kept a copy of the sealed log before Ash's men could destroy it. I have it here. I brought it in case they tried something like this." He was shoving through the crowd now, waving a folded, water-stained document above his head. It is Ash's own signature ordering the seal, dated the same day the bodies came up. It proves he knew about the sabotage before anyone else did. Why seal an honest inspection, unless you already knew what it would show? The document changed everything in an instant, and Tobias, Seeing his one chance and knowing there was no time left to wait for magistrates and clerks to slowly examine papers, while a noose tightened around the throat of the woman he loved, did the only thing left to him. He vaulted up the gallows steps 2 at a time, closing the distance to the platform before the stunned guards could react. And in the last possible second, the rope already snug, the trapdoor lever already beneath a guard's hand, Morag's furious, terrified eyes locked on his as she fought to buy even one more breath. He seized the rope above the noose and hauled it upward with every ounce of strength left in his battered body, wrenching the loop away from her throat even as the trapdoor guard, confused by the sudden chaos and Grendel's continuing shouts, hesitated with his hand still on the lever. "Stop!" Tobias bellowed, loud enough that it seemed to shock the entire yard into stillness. "There is proof in your hands right now that Corwin Ash knew about the sabotage that killed Morag Gorehorn before the widow's own claim assessors ever saw the inspection log. You are about to hang an innocent woman on the word of the very man who murdered her husband." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the great sawmill wheel, somewhere below, seemed to have gone quiet, though Tobias knew that was only his own racing pulse drowning out everything else. It was an old logger in the Crowdknot, but a gray-bearded man Tobias did not know who broke the silence first. "Let the magistrate see the paper," he called out, gruff and firm. "Before anyone hangs, let him see the paper." Others took up the call, a swelling wave of voices that Ash's careful control over the proceedings had no answer for, and Magistrate Kest, faced with a crowd no longer willing to simply watch in uncertain silence, was forced, visibly furious, to accept the document Grendel Voss thrust up onto the platform for his examination. It did not take long. Ash's own signature, dated and unmistakable, ordering the inspection seal before any legitimate assessment could occur. It was not, perhaps, a full confession of murder, but combined with the beam's sawmarks and Grendel's earlier testimony, it was enough, more than enough, for even a magistrate as bought and compromised as Silas Kest to recognize that the ground beneath his own feet had just become considerably less stable. "Release her," Kest said, his voice gone thin and strained. "The charge of murder is insufficiently proven to proceed at this time. Cut her loose." The rope came off Morag's throat, and she staggered forward off the platform's edge straight into Tobias's waiting arms, and he held her, both of them shaking, both of them alive, while the crowd around the gallows erupted into a roar of sound that was, this time, entirely on their side. Corwin Ash did not wait to see how the rest of the day unfolded. In the chaos of the crowd's fury turning fully toward him at last, loggers and miners who had tolerated a great deal from the company over the years but drew a hard line, it seemed, at watching an innocent woman nearly hanged on manufactured evidence. He fled the mill yard with what guards remained loyal to him, and though Magistrate Kest would spend the following weeks attempting to salvage his own position by distancing himself as far as possible from the merchant's schemes, it mattered little to Tobias in that moment, standing in the mud with Morag's face pressed into his shoulder, her whole body trembling with the aftermath of terror and relief and fury all tangled together. "I told you," she said into his shoulder, muffled and fierce, "not to throw yourself in front of blades for me." "I didn't throw myself in front of a blade this time," Tobias said. "I threw myself in front of a noose. Different situation entirely." Morag pulled back just far enough to look at him, and despite the blood still drying on her face, despite the exhaustion carved into every line of her, she laughed. A real laugh, disbelieving and alive before the laughter dissolved into something rower, and she kissed him again, slower this time, deeper, with none of the desperate mud-in crowd urgency of before, but with a tenderness that told him everything her pride would never quite let her say outright. "I love you," she said, when she finally broke away, the words coming out low and unguarded, as though she had been holding them back for days and simply had no strength left to hold them any longer. "I did not want to. I told myself I would not let myself want a man again after Borak, that it would break me if I lost him too. But you keep throwing yourself between me and every blade this mountain has to offer, and I cannot fight you and love you both, Tobias Easton, so I have stopped trying to fight the love. I love you too, Tobias said, and it felt like the truest thing he had ever said in his life. I think I started falling for you on that mountain road with a crossbow bolt in my shoulder, and I haven't stopped since. The weeks that followed brought their own reckoning, slower and quieter than the violence of the mill yard but no less thorough. Grendel Voss's documents, once examined properly by circuit officials called up from the lowlandsmen with no stake in Ash's schemes, and no patience for a corrupt local magistrate, led to a formal inquiry that stripped Corwin Ash of his position and his freedom both. And though the mountains never did surrender enough proof to hang him outright for Morag Gorehorn's murder, the sabotage charge alone was enough to see him marched off Blackridge Hollow in chains of his own. A small and imperfect but very real justice. Magistrate Kest, disgraced but not entirely ruined, was replaced within the month by a circuit judge with a considerably harder line against company interference in debtor proceedings. A change that mattered a great deal to every laborer, human and orc alike, still bound by debts to the Ironwood Trading Company's remaining local operations. Morag's claim on the eastern seam, its worth now beyond dispute and its ownership beyond challenge, was formally confirmed before the new court within weeks, and with it, the last shadow of Tobias's original debt, still technically outstanding despite everything, was settled in full, the guarantor's bond fulfilled and closed at last, exactly as the law demanded, exactly as she had sworn it would be from the moment she stormed through the courthouse doors. It was on the day the new judge formally struck the debt from the record, the same mill yard, though scrubbed now of mud and blood, filled with a crowd gathered not for a trial this time, but simply to watch the paperwork made official, that Morag turned to Tobias in front of the assembled camp and did something that made the whole yard fall silent all over again. She drew the knife from her hip, not in threat, but in ceremony, and cut a lock of her own dark hair, binding it with a small braided cord she produced from a pouch at her belt, an old orc custom, Tobias would learn later, reserved for claiming a mate before one's whole clan and community, a public declaration with no room left for ambiguity or retreat. I claimed this man's debt before this court once, she said, loud enough to carry across the whole gathered crowd, and I claim him now for something greater than any debt. Tobias Easton, will you be mine, before every soul gathered here to witness it, not as a debtor, not as a guarantor's charge, but as my chosen man, for as long as this mountain stands. Tobias, standing before the whole camp with his heart in his throat and every eye in Blackridge Hollow fixed upon him, did not hesitate for even a heartbeat. Yes, he said, taking the braided lock of hair from her hand and pressing it in turn, against his own heart in the old orc gesture he had watched the laborers perform months before. The one he had since learned meant a debt of gratitude too deep for words. I claimed you the moment you took a bolt shot in my place from caring, Morag Gorehorn. I have been yours since the mountain road. I will be yours until it crumbles. The crowd's reaction was not, this time, uncertain murmuring or wary silence. It was a cheer that rolled up the mountainside like a rockfall in reverse, humans and orcs both raising their voices together for the widow who had stormed a courthouse and the debtor she had claimed as her own. And if there remained, here and there in the crowd, a few faces still creased with the old prejudice that had divided their peoples for longer than either of them had been alive, it mattered little now, drowned as it was beneath the sound of a whole camp choosing, in that moment, to celebrate something braver and truer than the old hatreds had ever managed to be. They stayed in Blackridge Hollow through that winter, working the eastern seam together, Morag directing the careful, honest labor of miners now paid fairly under the new judge's oversight, Tobias managing the accounts, and the caravan routes with the same steady competence that had once nearly gotten him buried alive by a corrupt company's greed. and finding, in the doing of honest work beside a woman who had chosen him with her whole fierce heart, a satisfaction he had never known in all his years, guarding other men's cargo on other men's roads. In the evenings, in the small cabin that had once belonged to a dead man, and now belonged to the two of them together, they built a life measured not in grand gestures but in small, warm certainties or laughter, unguarded now in a way it had never been in those first weary days. His hands, steady and sure, learning the particular geography of loving a woman built for war who had somehow, against every hard lesson her life had taught her, decided to be soft only for him. Late one night, with snow falling thick and silent outside the shuttered window, and the fire banked low and warm upon the hearth, Morag traced the old scar on his shoulder with gentle fingers, the way she had that very first evening in this cabin, and said, quietly, into the dark between them, "I am glad you were foolish enough to catch a crossbow bolt for a stranger. I'm glad you were fierce enough to storm a courthouse for a debtor," Tobias answered, and pulled her close against him, and the mountain outside kept its old silence, and inside the small cabin that had become, at last and for good, a home, there was nothing left between them but the warm, unshakable certainty of two people who had found in each other exactly what both of them had least expected and most needed: to be chosen, wholly and without reservation, and never for the rest of their days to be alone again.